After battling Spanish colonial rule from 1809 until the decisive Battle of Pichincha on May 24, 1822, Ecuador finally broke free as part of Gran Colombia, a vast republic at the time that stretched across much of what is now Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, and parts of neighboring countries. Then, on May 13, 1830, amid rising regional tensions, it formally became the Republic of Ecuador under General Juan José Flores.
Ecuador libre!
Initially, Ecuador was a vulnerable, nascent state. Families practiced subsistence agriculture, where the families grew enough food to survive, but not with the purpose to export. They also participated in small-scale trade along rivers and rudimentary roads. However, trade was limited to small riverboats and dirt trails, and the country had virtually no infrastructure. No railways, no highways, and minimal fiscal capacity. As a result, Ecuador remained economically marginalized with low access to external markets and investment. That all began to shift in the late 19th century with the rise of cocoa. Ecuador discovered a global appetite for its Arriba Nacional cocoa, renowned for its floral aroma. Production jumped from about 6,500 metric tons to nearly 40,000 metric tons by the 1890s. Making Ecuador responsible for roughly 15 to 25% of the world's cocoa exports. Coastal cities like Guayaquil transformed. Shipping terminals blossomed, banks emerged to finance hacienda expansion, and led to an emergence of a new Gran Cacao elite. This new class of people were wealthy plantation owners who controlled much of the country's economy and even influenced politics. Yet, beneath this prosperity lay a harsher reality. Thousands of laborers, many from the Andean highlands, took up work under sharecropping agreements, in which they received land and tools in exchange for giving roughly half of their harvest to landowners. Often, they lived in debt to merchants, and this often led to a debt trap, which pushes them in a cycle of poverty. Yet the sweet promise turned bitter
by the 1910s.
A combination of global oversupply triggered by West African cocoa production, the disruption of World War I, and devastating fungal diseases, frosty pod and witch's broom, struck Ecuador's cocoa sector hard. Cocoa exports plunged by over 70%, falling from early highs to near 15,000 metric tons by 1930. Thousands of smallholders lost their livelihoods, causing mass urban migration and rural poverty. Politically, the collapse of the cocoa era destabilized governments, fueling coups and populist alternations through the 1920s and 30s. In response, Ecuador pivoted to bananas during the 1940s and 1950s, benefiting from government-sponsored replanting schemes and new rail and road connections to ports. Bananas overtook cocoa as the country's largest export. By the early 1950s, agricultural exports reached around USD $30 million. From 1950 to 1970, agriculture's share of GDP fell from nearly 39% to 25%, reflecting the diversification into emerging industries. At the same time, investment surged in construction, utilities, and manufacturing. Coastal towns sprouted canneries, sugar mills, and other agro-based factories, marking a modest move toward industrialization. Then came a dramatic twist: oil. When oil was discovered near Lago Agrio in the Amazon in 1967 by a Texaco Gulf consortium, it marked a turning point in the history of Ecuador and surpassed anything seen since the 1870s cocoa boom. With the Trans-Ecuadorian Pipeline, SOTE, and Esmeraldas refinery operational by 1972, first oil began flowing. These pipeline and refinery helped in linking the Amazon to the Pacific coast. Official oil exports surged from just US $43 million in 1971 to over $350 million by 1974, a near tenfold jump that catapulted Ecuador into global energy importance. Seizing this opportunity, the military junta, led by General Guillermo Rodriguez Lara, who came to power in a 1972 coup, used that oil windfall to become an active member of OPEC in 1973. The regime launched ambitious infrastructure programs. Highways threaded into the rainforest, state-run Ecuador, known initially as CEPE, was founded in 1972, and the Esmeraldas petrochemical complex started operation.
In 1975, Ecuador experienced a political and economic flashpoint during General Guillermo Rodriguez Lara's military rule. Public discontent had been simmering since 1974, as oil-generated wealth wasn't trickling down and inflation was eroding real wages. In response, Rodriguez Lara's government aggressively increased the export tax on oil, overstepping into nationalist economic control. That triggered a production cutback by foreign oil firms and narrowed the government's fiscal space. In July 1975, the government reversed course by cutting export taxes, but inflation remained stubbornly high, around 22 to 25%. Amid this turbulence, consumers faced rising prices, trade imbalances, and strict economic controls. To relieve pressure, Rodriguez Lara imposed a steep 60% tariff on luxury imports, hoping to ease balance of payment stress. But this move backfired. Business leaders in Quito and Guayaquil, who relied heavily on imports, fiercely opposed the tariff hike. Their growing frustration coalesced with widespread citizen anger, fueled by protest over both inflation and the prospect of full oil nationalization. Against this backdrop, a coup attempt known as the Funeral Parlor Coup unfolded on August 31st to September 1st, 1975. Disaffected military officers, led by General Raúl González Alvear and General Alejandro Solís Rosero, orchestrated the uprising from a funeral home near the presidential palace. The rebels mobilized tanks and troops into Quito's historic center, triggering violent clashes that claimed more than 20 lives and wounded dozens. Though the coup failed, it exposed cracks within the military and public institutions. In response, Rodriguez Lara imposed curfews, arrested coup leaders, shut down media coverage, and called the crisis a symbol of a divided national direction. Facing mounting internal dissent, Rodriguez Lara was forced out in January 1976, in a relatively bloodless transition engineered by other military officers who installed a ruling triumvirate led by Admiral Alfredo Poveda.
Between 1970 and 1977, real GDP growth averaged over 9% annually, a dramatic leap from the previous decade's 5.9%, while manufacturing grew by about 13% annually. The government simultaneously piled on debt. The imports of the country surged at 7% per year between 1974 to 79, and this led to more external borrowing. The borrowing jumped from US $324 million in 1972 to over US $4.5 billion by 1979, and by 1980 comprised nearly 40% of GDP. The economic foundation beneath the oil boom proved fragile. In the early 1980s, Ecuador found itself hit by a classic oil glut as global oil prices fell drastically, dropping from over $35 per barrel in 1980 to below $10 by 1986. The steep decline was driven by several interconnected factors. Firstly, the energy-efficient technologies and conservation policies adopted after the energy crises of the 1970s lowered global oil demand across industrialized nations. Rising non-OPEC supply from the North Sea, Alaska, and the Soviet Union flooded the market, outpacing OPEC's capacity to curb production. Economies in Europe, the US, and Japan slowed down, further depressing demand. Meanwhile, major producers like Saudi Arabia ramped up output in 1986, trying to regain market share and hastening the price collapse. Meanwhile, El Niño floods of 1982 to 83 led to droughts and floods in the country, devastated its infrastructure, and spiking global interest rates triggered a deep recession. Inflation surged past 50%, and a destructive 1987 earthquake crippled pipeline infrastructure for 6 months. That year, Ecuador defaulted on private debt, increased tariffs on transports and energy, slashed public investment, and briefly withdrew from OPEC in search of revenue. The sucre was devalued twice in 1982 and 1983, while the IMF-mandated program tightened fiscal policy even further. That fragility came to a head in 1999. A collapse in oil prices combined with a collapsing banking system plunged Ecuador into crisis. Inflation soared into the 60 to 70% range. Interest rates exceeded 70% and the sucre collapsed, reaching as low as 24,000 per USD. With banks insolvent and citizens withdrawing deposits, the government froze accounts and declared a state of emergency. Faced with hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and social upheaval, Ecuador took a historic step. In 2000, it dollarized, replacing the sucre with the US dollar. This sudden shift stabilized prices and exchange rates, restored investor confidence, and effectively ended inflation. It dropped to single digits by 2003 and remained around 3.7% in 2022, among the lowest in Latin America. Leveraging this new stability and record oil prices, the decade from 2006 to 2014 marked a renaissance under President Rafael Correa. Public expenditure nearly doubled to 8.6% of GDP, and funds flowed into massive projects like the Coca-Codo-Sinclair hydroelectric dam. Ecuador's 2008 constitution, enshrining the groundbreaking rights of nature, reflected an inclusive vision of development. During this period, poverty fell from 38.3% in 2006 to 25.8% by 2014, while extreme poverty dropped from 31% in 2001 to just 11% in 2012. Significant strides linked to welfare programs, schooling, electrification, and social services. Furthermore, Ecuador leveraged high oil prices and expansionary policies in this period to record average GDP growth of 4.3%. Yet after 2014, oil prices dropped once again, prompted by global oversupply. This collapse strained public finances and returned the budget to deficits. A center-right government took office in 2017, initiating structural reforms and controls. But then the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The economy shrank nearly 9% in 2020. However, a $6.5 billion IMF support package between 2019 and 2022 stabilized fiscal accounts, helping the country rebound in 2021 and a further 2022. Public debt hovered near 57% of GDP by year-end 2022, high but manageable given the dollarized framework. By 2022, Ecuador had reset for a new growth cycle. Oil still generated around 10.8 billion US dollars, 27 to 30% of exports, but the nation's economy was gaining real breath. A 2023 referendum stopped drilling in Yasuni National Park, affirming Ecuadorians' preference for ecological conservation over short-term revenue. Meanwhile, Ecuador formalized its rights of nature in its 2008 constitution, the first nation to do so, framing environmental stewardship as a legal principle. Mining emerged as a fresh diversification pathway. Exports jumped from USD $282 million in 2018 to USD $2.2 billion in 2022, powered by projects like the Fruta del Norte gold mine and Mirador copper mine. The World Bank reported that formal mining jobs jumped from 37,000 in 2021 to around 273,000 by 2025, creating millions more indirectly. The sector's popularity stems from global demand for copper and gold, government incentives, and rising global demand for commodities used in green technology transitions. Interesting to note that Ecuador is estimated to have USD $220 billion in mineral reserves. Agriculture and aquaculture continue to anchor livelihoods and exports. Shrimp farming led the non-petroleum sectors, raking in USD $8 billion in 2022, well ahead of bananas at USD $3.5 billion. Ecuador is the world's top shrimp exporter, supporting coastal economies and establishing sustainable farming protocols. Meanwhile, cocoa, coffee, and roses, especially high-grade varieties, bring prestige and earnings from specialty markets. In 2017 alone, flour exports reached USD $846 million. Emerging niche crops like quinoa and dragon fruit further signal agricultural diversification and upward economic mobility in rural regions. Ecuador's industrial sector remains modest, roughly 12 to 15% of GDP, but it is evolving. One of the key manufactured goods is canned tuna, whose exports reached USD $1.34 billion in 2022. Others include cooking oils, dairy products, cement, and light vehicle assembly. Modernizing this sector remains a priority as it offers pathways to higher wages, value-added exports, and resilience against commodity shocks. The government is putting effort to promote export-oriented manufacturing by building industrial zones around Guayaquil and Quito, improving logistics and creating friendly policies for foreign investment. Tourism has emerged as a high-potential growth frontier, with 2.4 million international visitors generating USD 1.8 billion in 2018 and tourism contributing approximately
2.9%
of GDP by 2023. The industry is making strides. Iconic destinations like the Galapagos Islands, Colonial Quito, Cloud Forests in Mindo, and Pacific beaches attract over 200,000 tourists, with individual spends averaging around $1,500 per cent. Analysis shows a 10% rise in tourism correlates with a 31% income increase among Ecuador's poorest communities, and each $10 million in tourist spending translates into roughly $23 million in GDP, making it a powerful driver of inclusive growth.
Despite these positive developments, Ecuador still faces some structural challenges. Ecuador is still commodity dependent, even with diversification. Furthermore, over 50% of employment is informal. Moreover, institutional and bureaucratic constraints hamper its competitiveness. Corruption is high in Ecuador. According to Transparency International, Ecuador scored 32
out of
100s on the 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index, ranking 121
out of
180. While Ecuador's rank places it near Peru, 127th, and ahead of Venezuela, 178th, it trails behind regional neighbors like Chile and Uruguay, highlighting remaining governance project. Ecuador is heavily reliant on hydropower. Around 80% of electricity comes from this single source, and this has led to shortages of water, giving rise to drought-like conditions in many situations. Organized crime siphoned about $215 million in stolen fuel from Petroecuador pipelines, and this needs to be stopped. Politically, tensions remain high. In 2023, President Lasso dissolved the National Assembly amid indigenous protests over extraction policies, reflecting deep social friction. Still, the response is structured and hopeful. The Noboa administration is pushing reforms focused on diversification, tourism, mining, agro-industry, fintech, and manufacturing, while reinforcing fiscal discipline in line with IMF targets. Environmental protection remains central to national identity, energized by legislation like the rights of nature and a tourism model rooted in ecological conservation. Yet, with prudent policies and broad public support, Ecuador is poised for another transformation, one that seeks not only prosperity but sustainability and social equity.